Hello, and welcome to Timing is Everything, a program of Care Dimensions. My name is Mary Crowe, Director of Professional and Community Education at Care Dimensions. I am so thrilled today to have Claire WIllis on the program. Claire is the author of Opening to Grief, and this is such an important topic. Claire, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. And, I want to start out by please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a clinical social worker and I live in Brookline, and I've been working with people who are living with cancer for about 30 years. My primary focus is on bereavement, end of life, cancer support, and therapeutic writing. And that's just my passion. I really love working with people at this juncture of their life.
Isn't that wonderful? Wow, 30 years, what an accomplishment. And, it's so nice, wonderful that you're there. People truly need this type of support. So tell it, I'm really interested. I want to just show a graphic, if we may, around your book right now, because I had the joy, the pleasure of reading this book. And I have to tell you, I'm so impressed. There we go. There's a graphic around it. And I'll tell you, I loved this book. It just was filled with such compassionate information around grief and around healing and so many resources, Claire. So what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I had personal motivations and I had professional motivations. Personally, I grew up in a family in which grief was not expressed, but it sat heavily in my home, unspoken, and in the hearts, I think, of every family member. Each of my parents experienced violent suicides with a sibling and an in-law, and the sorrow was unspeakable for them. And I knew from the time I was young that I wanted something different. And so this is the path I went on, working with people who were grieving. And what I found over and over was that I was hearing the same questions in my bereavement groups all the time. And the questions really made me sad. Am I grieving right? When will this be over? Will I ever, I always feel this terrible. And somehow there was a benchmark that people were comparing themselves to. And I think it was one of the models of grief that was probably not intended for bereavement, but was intended for people that are dying. And I think grief is hard enough, but when you start to judge how you're grieving, then it becomes a whole nother thing. So I wanted to normalize grief and give people complete permission to grieve however they needed, and to break open the privatization of pain. So I hear things in my group like, I would only say this here. And I think that's such a sad statement, because too often our grief swirls with shame and self-criticism and not doing it right. So that was my professional motivation for wanting to open this topic up in our culture. And I think that's one of the benefits of COVID, that it's brought grief into mainstream media, and we're beginning to talk about it.
Yeah. We're just such a death denying society, but there's just this lack, like you're saying it, that we're not paying attention to this grief. So I want to be able to have you talk more about, some of the important factors around grief too, that you touched on in the book, because you brought up some very important points. Grief is something that will affect us all. And I just want to make sure that you address some of these other factors that are so important around grief.
Well, it's not that it will affect us all. I think it is and has been affecting us all, actually. But I want to start this by just reading a short quote by Jamie Anderson. And unfortunately, this quote is not in the book, but the book, this message permeates the book. And I think this is a really important way to frame grief. So Jamie Anderson writes, "Grief, I have learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corner of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go."
Wow.
So when people talk to me about wanting to get over their grief, I say, then you're getting over your love.
Right.
So I think when I think about what I want people to know and the important points about grieving. One is that there are no stages to grief. That's like the big thing, because I think a lot of people tend to think there are. It is not a linear process. It's 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 steps forward, or maybe 4 back, 2 steps forward. It never ends because our love doesn't change, but it does change over time in frequency, duration, and intensity. And that's a pretty sure benchmark. And I also always say that grief has as many different faces as there are people who are grieving. I think a lot of us tend to think of this as grief as being sorrow, sadness, despair, hopelessness. But actually, it's not just those feelings, but it's impatience, it's anger, it's irritability, it's regret, it's gratitude, it's many, many feelings. It often impacts us with forgetfulness and inability to concentrate, sleeplessness. It has a lot of behavioral manifestations too, and also in eating, overeating, undereating. So there's just so many ways grief can show. And I think one of the things that you've probably found, and I find, is that one of the stresses in families is that people are grieving differently. And what happens is the person that's grieving with anger or irritability doesn't get seen for grieving. They just see them as a difficult member of the family when someone else is crying a lot. And if we can look underneath to the suffering behind some of these behaviors that aren't really typical of someone who's happy, we see that this is grief that's gone amok. And I think anger is a common one because it gives us a false sense of agency. A lot of people can't bear to feel helplessness and vulnerability. It's too painful. They don't feel safe. And so their grief may come out as anger or rage. And so just to be patient with one another and try to extend some compassion to one another when we're grieving. Just 2 more things I want to say about this. There's a phenomenon called STUG, which stands for a sudden temporary upsurge of grief. And often people will say in my groups, oh, I thought I was doing so well. And I walked down the supermarket aisle and I saw a can of tuna and I started to sob because that was my daughter's favorite fish. Yep. And I say, you didn't lose it, you got it. You grasped the full catastrophe of the loss. And we can't take in the loss. We have to experience grief in waves because it protects our psyche. But we have those moments of breakthrough. They're sudden and they're always temporary, and they move away, usually within 24 hours. And it doesn't mean that you're not grieving properly or you've lost your way or anything like that. Stephen Levine has a beautiful quote. He says, looking at death is like looking at the sun. You look, you turn away, you look, and you turn away. Because if you stare at it, you'll burn your eyes. Yeah. So it's the same way with grief. We can't be in it all the time, and we have to allow for those moments. So I think that the other thing I just want to mention, I hope I'm not talking too long.
No, please keep going. This is important information.
I think one of the things I want to talk about for a moment is the concept of secondary losses, because naming these, I think, is so important. So, for instance, if you've recently lost your spouse, say, you've lost the person you loved, and that's considered a primary loss. But there's a ton of other losses that might accompany that loss, which are called secondary, but they're actually not secondary in impact. And so, for instance, if you lost your spouse, you may have lost a co-parent or a co-grandparent. You may lose your home. You may lose economic security. You may lose your travel partner. There's the loss has tendrils into every aspect of your life. You may find, which is very common, that your friendships shift, that people come forward you didn't expect, and people disappear you thought would be there. Those are very important losses. I had a woman in my bereavement group the other night say something very courageous about this. And she said, the loss of my spouse, and actually it was her partner, is not as impactful for me as the loss of the identity of being part of a couple.
Wow.
And so for her, there was a huge shift in identity. And so these losses, we just have to remember, have tendrils into every aspect of our life. So you're not only grieving the person, you're grieving everything that comes around that.
Absolutely. And right now, because we can't negate the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And certainly, like you say, I mean, we're talking about the loss of individuals, but loss falls on so many different levels, like you're talking about. And certainly, there's not a person in this world who's not experiencing some form of grief around the many losses that we've endured right now, haven't we?
Yeah. And a lot of them are invisible to the culture.
Yeah.
So as we were talking earlier, one of the big ones is pet loss that you don't hear anything about.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it too, and you're speaking of this so eloquently, I think that sometimes we judge or measure, so, and I think that's really hard for people because they feel like their grief is not as important in another person's grief. And this is not a competition. We all suffer and we all have this pain, and one's pain is their own. And I think that that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, I always say grief is a non-compare zone.
Yes.
But I can teach this, but I don't always know it because last year on March 1st, I lost my 14-year-old pet companion. And I didn't know we were going to go into a COVID, and I wanted a quarantine period. I wanted so much to gather my friends around to spread his ashes, and I diminished. I shamed myself for feeling the grief I felt about my dog, because what was happening in the world was so much bigger. And I think sometimes it's hard to acknowledge these smaller losses because we do compare ourselves. And I always say there's just different grief, and we can't say one is more or greater than the other. They're just all different.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's the thing, is that, people, I think, are hesitating sometimes, or, it almost gets into a shaming where, stop your complaining that you didn't get your graduation because there are people dying out there. Again, this is not a competition. It's not a comparative. Let's acknowledge each other's loss and suffering, and then again, help each other heal through this at a time when we need to hold each other up the most. Sometimes we're not always the kindest, which I want to bring up in this, Claire, because again, another factor that I love in this book is, you bring up this term meta, and I really, would you talk about this for me? Because I loved this. And it really, I think, resonates with not just now, but always.
So meta meditation is a mindfulness practice. Sometimes it's called a loving kindness practice, or it's called, and I love this, tender friend. And basically it's a form of self-blessing. It involves befriending ourselves at a very difficult time. And in the book, each chapter closes with a meditation for you to say to yourself. So they're short phrases, and they usually sound this. I'll just read you the meta from my first chapter.
Sure.
May I welcome all my feelings as I grieve. May I allow grief to soften and strengthen my heart. May I hold my sorrow with tenderness and compassion. So they're aspirations that you send to yourself, because our suffering is suffering is created from our inability to be with what is, whether we like it or not. It's when we push against it that we're laying more distress over what's already difficult, i.e. the loss. So to the extent that we can be with our suffering, be with our loss, we will suffer less, and letting it just work and tenderize us, and letting it connect us more deeply to ourselves and one another.
Yeah, I think this is such a nice point, because I love reading that again, because you talked about how meditative practice can actually help in terms of intense suffering in this way.
Well, there's some research that I love this research because it's so true. That 50% of the time, if with the average person, we're focused on the future. 40% of the time, we're focused on the past. And on a really good day, we're focused in the moment. And I think when you lose somebody that you love, it's very easy to project despair in the future. And what we want to do is try to capture these thoughts and rein them in and come back to the present moment. I'm alive today, I'm okay. And this practice helps tether our mind with our breath and with the words, anchoring us in the present moment.
Yeah. You know what I love when you were just talking prior to that too, it says, what it feels like is that we just need permission, just permission to feel and to be the way we need to be in our grief. And also we need to give others permission to be the way they need to be with, again, that lack of judgment. It's so hard to get permission from other people, but I find that sometimes it's even harder to give ourselves permission to just be the way we need to be.
I certainly struggle with that periodically, but I think the other thing that's just important to mention here is that it's very hard to give another person permission for feelings you can't allow to sit in your own heart. And that's why I think doing your own, I hate to say working with your own grief and being with your own grief will open you up to being with those other people in your life that are grieving, because you'll know something about what it's like to sit with this that you don't know before. And I think part of this is why relationships and friendship circles tend to change and shift in the face of someone dying, because some people can't tolerate to see a friend of theirs widowed or alone. They just have to move away and they just don't know what to say. Yeah. And other people who do know come forward.
Yeah. So how isolating though it is. I mean, grief is so isolating in its own right, but then we add to the isolation by our inability, right, to be comfortable with others' discomfort.
There's a wonderful little Buddhist story about arrows, and it's called The Two Arrows, and I'm not going to do it complete justice, but you'll get the essence of it. The first arrow that is shot is just the loss. It's whatever you've just lost. The second arrow is, I don't know what's the matter with me. When am I ever going to get over this? I can't stand the way I'm acting. And the litany of self-destructive things we can say to each other, that creates the suffering. The first arrow is sorrow. The second arrow brings us to suffering because we're wanting things to be different. And as my teacher says, our preferences are the source of all our suffering. Wow. And don't I know that?
Yeah. No, I think those are, again, very important points. Another thing that you talked about in the book was about nature and how, can you speak about how nature can be a source of healing?
Yeah, I think as human beings, we have an instinctive draw to nature to bond and affiliate with other life forms. We're a little bit like moths drawn to light. I love that image of moths drawn to light. And I felt that especially during the pandemic. And unfortunately, for most of us, our fast-moving, tech-focused lives, we're tied to electronics for much of the day. And some of us are even tied to electronics when we're out in the world. So Stephen and Rachel Kaplan did some wonderful research on restorative environments, which are basically environments outdoors that might be a garden, it might be a pocket park in the city. And if you're confined to inside, it might be just being able to look out at the sky. When we're outside, our eyes are in a receptive position. They are just receiving the images. There's no energy asked of us. When we sit at the computer or on our iPhone or whatever, we are focused and it's exhausting over time. So there's a way that we can restore in nature. I think the natural world also reminds us that of everything. The seasons remind us of the impermanence of everything, the impermanence of the good and the impermanence of the bad, and that your grief won't always feel this way. And I think some of the seasons often reflect that promise. For instance, spring, the promise of renewal; winter, the letting go; fall, the letting go, so that we can see ourselves mirrored. Also, I just want to mention something. There's these walking groups that are developing actually in this country too, but they started in Canada, where people who are grieving walk together. And they say the name of the person they loved. They say when they died. And then everybody just walks. There's no advice. There's nothing but just walking together in their sorrow. This is quite beautiful.
Wonderful, yeah, and that's symbolic on so many different levels, isn't it? We need that sense of community. We need that companioning for people to be by our sides and not leading us. It's just so important on so many different levels. I love that, and just the silence of it, and be able to be with your feelings. Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, I think that, people think that grief is a passive process, but we know that it's exhausting and that it takes a lot of energy, doesn't it? So when you're talking about nature too, I'm thinking what a pleasant relief, in terms of doing that, because this is really, and the other thing I wanted to say too is what you have mentioned a couple of times. Listen, the goal of grief is not to get over it. It's to become more tolerable with time, right? And just do that healing process. So I think because you'll hear people say in attempts to soothe somebody else, you'll get over it. That's something we never want to hear. It's not something a grieving human being wants to hear, is it?
Right. No, we don't want to hear it, because getting over grief means becoming not loving what you lost.
Exactly.
You don't want to do that.
Yep, exactly.
There is a whole thrust in our culture to get beyond it. Are you still grieving? I hear this in my bereavement groups all the time, what different people say to those that are grieving.
Yeah, just a little pressure. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of pressure. That's right.
I'm going to talk too about, just this, you had talked about transforming suffering. Could you speak a little bit more about that in the book?
Yeah, how the word, well, I think one of the things, I'll just use myself for an example, actually. So I'm passionate about this work, and the root of the word passion is suffering. And often we are passionate about things we have known about through our own suffering. And our passion is a wish to keep other people from feeling or experiencing what we feel. And a lot of activism is generated by suffering. So that's one of the ways to transform suffering and that's not something that happens when you first lose somebody, for sure. That's just something that takes time, that you come into, and you become generous through your grief. You want to give back in some way. I mean, I think that's one way. The other way about transforming it, I think, is to repeat what I've already said. It's that being with your grief will transform it over time. It will open your heart, and it will be much more tolerable and much less that searing pain that you have at the very beginning. So bringing kindness and acceptance to our grief is the very beginning, I think, of working to transform our suffering, letting it be there in its fullness, because that will allow it to move through us and transform on its own.
Yeah, that's very important.
In the book, I mentioned this practice, which is common in Buddhist circles, but it's not certainly unique to them. And it's a practice of RAIN, which that's the acronym RAIN. And it's when you have a lot of strong feelings, when your grief feels just too much. The R in RAIN stands for recognizing it. So taking the time to name it. The A is allowing it, letting it be there. The I is investigating it. What's beneath this? What more is there besides this huge emotion that I'm feeling? And the last is to nurture it, to nurture the loss, nurture yourself in the process of these strong feelings.
That's excellent. Do you, one of the things I had mentioned that I love about the book too is that it's just filled with resources. So in addition to these practices at the end of each section, there's also, I love how you included a list of poems. You've listed a list of books, really readily available, these resources that people can utilize. What are the suggestions and actually even online resources? So I love that you did that in the book. Can you, I know we have this time goes by too fast when we're talking about topics that are so important. But take some time here, Claire, and just what advice would you give? Because again, a lot of people out there that are grieving and suffering, what would you suggest for them in terms of getting the support around this that they need?
Um, well, of course, I think bereavement groups, a well-run bereavement group is people can finish each other's sentences. There's a shorthand that goes between people in my group. And I think sometimes there's an invisible fence between people who are grieving and the rest of the world. And they look okay and they aren't okay inside. So I think and not everybody's a group person. So that's not the answer for everybody. Another thing is to find a grief friend, is to find somebody who's been through what you've been through or something akin to it, and with whom you can sit and be just as you are without anybody saying, when are you going to get over this? When are you going to meet somebody new? Whatever is the version of people wanting something for yourself that you're not there. That's not what you're wanting for yourself. I would say that it's funny. I just reached down to pick up something to read, and it's a poem. And can I read it?
Sure can. Please do.
I think this is such an important thing, and because there's a lot of invisible griefs that are untended in our lives, that just don't get the acknowledgement that they should. The grief of aging, the grief of retirement, the grief of losing an animal, the grief of losing your job. I mean, there are no rituals for any of this. The grief of immigrants, the grief of our climate crisis. I mean, it's everywhere, but we don't have ways to be with one another to help hold one another. There's a poem I'd like to read called Naming by Carol Lynn Knight. If I name this grief, define it without guilt and redemption, call it drowning, desolation, call it fire and stone, then I am bound to care for it. Like a stray cat I name that demands I feed him. He comes and goes, sometimes disappears for days and then returns, insisting that I remember. So this poem, I think, to one of the things we were talking about is important, because I think one of the things that COVID has done, besides bring new grief into our life, and certainly we've lost life as we knew it forever. I mean, it's going to come back in some form. But the other thing is that any grief that we didn't grieve has probably been resurrected in this time. So, as the poem says, naming it and caring for it, because it will insist that you remember, and it will come back in sideways ways that you probably don't want. Right. So being with the grief is really a sacred passage to your heart in a way, and to the hearts of other people.
That's well said, Claire. I'll have to tell you, and I think that's a very important point, that we can't push it down, that we can't make it go away, that we have to go through the process to hopefully get through the healing piece. And that's part of the healing, is to go through that. And it's very important that people understand that, because again, we don't like the feelings, so we try to push them away. I want to have, if you can bring up the graphic again of Claire's book. And Claire, can you share where, because again, I think that this is a wonderful resource for people. So I'd like you to just tell people where they can get a hold of your book from.
Well, any independent bookstore can order it. And I try to encourage people to support their local bookstores, because I'm afraid we're not going to have bookstores going forward. But it is, of course, available on Amazon. You also can read a fair amount about it on Amazon. There's, if you scroll down to the page the book's on, there's a lot of excerpts from it and some photographs, and it's quite beautiful what the publisher put together. So either your local store and I have a webpage, which is called openingtogrief.com, if you wanted to get in touch with me for any reason.
Perfect. Claire, thank you so much. And thank you for being on the program today.
Well, thanks for having me, Mary. I've loved talking to you.
Oh, thank you. The same here. It's been a pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in to Timing is Everything. And we look forward to you being on the next show. I'm Mary Crowe. Thank you.